Bonjour tout le monde. Je vais vous présenter Roberto Foa, que j'avais invité en fait pour venir faire une présentation dans mon cours sur un type particulier de méthodologie. Mais là, on a la totale parce que Roberto avait aussi fait une présentation à Séoul sur ce qu'il a fait avec cette méthodologie-là, entre autres, qui est de regarder l'opinion publique en Russie. Dans une session spéciale où il y avait d'autres personnes qui regardaient l'opinion publique en Russie avec des méthodologies différentes, qui d'ailleurs convergeaient pas mal. So, in English, Roberto Foa, he comes to Montreal because he was in Toronto and he wanted to see us. And also is presenting in my course, survey methods course tomorrow about the method he uses. The method itself comes from Toronto, and it was elaborated during the COVID crisis by people in health services who thought that web opt-in polls were not good enough. But he uses it to look at public opinion in Russia right now. And so I will let Roberto present, and after his presentation, we can ask questions. So, and I will share the screen so that it is recorded and we will see it. I think here I can okay. And you need this.
Okay. OK. Merci pour l'invitation d'être ici aujourd'hui, l'occasion de rendre visite à Montréal et au Québec. Tout d'abord, oui, je suis très, très désolé que je vais continuer en langue anglaise. I will continue in English, which is a shame, parce que même si mon français est très rouillé, j'apprécie toujours l'occasion de pratiquer un peu, faire pratique de langue. Okay, so I will speak in English, but of course, if anyone wants to switch, we can switch, of course, into French at any point. So it's a bit of an irony today, this talk, because this is a talk here at the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. And in fact, I will be talking about the study of authoritarian citizenship instead, which is a topic I know a fair amount, as that's really, in a way, been one of the recurring features of my work in the study of public opinion, so to speak, on the ground in terms of actual fieldwork projects that I've led over the years. So just to give a little bit of background, I first got started working with l'Enquête mondiale sur les valeurs, the World Value Survey, almost 20 years ago now. And I guess partly being somebody who's come to the project fairly late means that you get all of the countries that are sort of hard to study, sort of more remote countries that are new to the project. So the first country that I started working on was Rwanda, all the way back in 2007, which is, of course, then and is still today a very closed society, and certainly a society in which one can study citizenship, but perhaps not democratic citizenship. And then a number of the team, the Russia World Value Survey team got a large grant, and a number of people went over to Russia. So I spent a year at the High School of Economics in St. Petersburg campus. And we also led some surveys within Russia. So we did special surveys in Tajikistan, where I went out there to Siberia as well. We did some extra surveys, and also in Central Asia. And so I was the PI for the Uzbekistan survey in 2012, which is also an extremely closed society. And then subsequent to that have been PI for Indonesia and for Bangladesh in the World Value Survey, which are less closed societies, but bring their own unique challenges. And in terms of methodological challenges, I know tomorrow we'll have a chance in the seminar to talk a bit about methodology. But just in terms of methodological challenges of doing public opinion research in these places, the obvious challenges are obviously around non-response, non-participation, response bias, sensitivity bias. So, when we would do the surveys in Rwanda, for example, you would knock on people's doors in the city, and they would be very, very afraid. But you say we want to do a face-to-face survey, and if they were okay with that, they would let you in quickly, close the doors so nobody could see. Whereas if you did a survey in a rural area in Rwanda, then that wasn't possible. But instead, the interviewees would take you to the most public place possible so that everyone could see what was going on and to see that there was nothing untoward happening. But of course, the answers that they gave you maybe would not be the most reliable answers for that reason. Official interference and censorship, these are huge problems. Again, pretty much in all of these contexts, that's been an issue of one kind or another, just being told to remove questions or have somebody there who's sort of watching the surveys, and that's a requirement by law. And I think something that I'd like to come back to, but I think is a really understudied issue, is that often when we study democratic citizenship through public opinion surveys in democratic societies, there's always this sort of post-converse debate about whether public opinion exists. But in authoritarian societies, it's something far more extreme, almost on a sort of ontological level, which is that, it's not just that, we think about these things in terms of sort of response bias, with this idea that, okay, there's a sort of true opinion that is being masked, that people are not giving us, and only if we had a better methodology, we would get at people's true opinions. But I actually think it's a little bit more complicated than that in many authoritarian societies, because there is a degree of distortion in the information environment and a combination of sort of depoliticization, people kind of withdrawing from thinking about politics because that's dangerous. You don't want to be someone who thinks too much about politics, and sort of the ability to sort of perform sort of multiple simultaneous ways of thinking about politics, right? So one moment you give one kind of answer, which is the official one. You may have several other ways that you think about an issue, and it's not necessarily the case that one of those represents somebody's true belief. But anyway, that's a whole debate we don't need to get into today. But I would like to talk today about one country in particular, which is surveys in Russia. Now, Russia, of all the non-democratic societies out there in the world today, is, I think, one of the most interesting places to be doing public opinion research, because why? Well, we're 2.5 years into a huge conflagration and a war in which we fundamentally do not know the answer to some basic questions about what the Russian people believe. Do Russians support this war still? Did they ever support the war? Would they support further mobilization? Would they like to achieve a rapid peace treaty of some kind, or a ceasefire with Ukraine? What kind of levels of dissent out there exist? Could those lead to protest? And what effect, if any, have Western policies actually had on Russian public opinion, in particular, various waves of sanctions? Now, if we go by official surveys, or if we go by at least the remaining sources within Russia that are sort of asking questions on these issues, these would be the kinds of answers you would get to those questions, right? Which is that there's overwhelming public support for the war. Government approval shot up when the war began and is now back to sort of all-time highs of sort of 80% plus approval ratings for the president of Russia. People are actually happier and even more satisfied with life than ever before, and say that the household financial situation is really fantastic too. And you can find that on the Levada measures. You can find that on Vision measures. I just put one here. They have this slightly confusing life satisfaction index, but you can actually go in and see what questions compose that. And they're sort of fairly standard life satisfaction questions about whether people think their lives are better now than they were 12 months ago, and that kind of thing. What you can see is that, there was a big jump, at least on their index, when the war began. And if you update that, you see it's pretty much held fairly high in the period since. Okay, so for us as survey researchers, what do we do in this kind of situation, right? Do we just accept that as the reality? Or if we don't, then what alternative methods do we have to try and get at this issue of what Russian people really believe, if we think that Russians perhaps believe something different? And so the answer is, there a different approach? I would say there are different approaches that can be useful in the context of trying to validate or not validate the other sources that are out there. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot over the last few years is the various ways in which, because there's also been a broader crisis within survey research methodology around declining response rates, around sensitivity bias, whether we're really getting true opinions, even within surveys in democratic societies. One of the issues that's sort of been at the back of my mind is, well, how can we use the vast explosion of data that exists out there in terms of search, in terms of social media or satellite or new methods of doing online polling, obviously web panels, but also other methods that I'll get into, that we can, if not replace old methodologies, at least old modes of doing public opinion research, at least add an additional layer, right, that can give us a bit more complexity, a bit more of an angle on what's out there. One of my favorite quotes that I overuse, William Gibson, who's Canadian. Actually, moved to Canada, if I'm not mistaken. Future is already here, not equally distributed. A less well-known quote, however, of William Gibson is this one: "It is impossible to move, to live, operate at any level without leaving traces of information," right? So in some, we as researchers can try and hoover up that information and use that for an inference about what people think. And today I'm just going to talk about two methodologies and what they tell us potentially about what Russians think, before maybe a few reflections on broader lessons for studying opinion in non-democratic societies. The first method, so when we first started to think about this really a year and a half ago, our first method was to look at search data. As Claire's mentioned, that's because we had already been doing a project previously during the pandemic, where we had combined almost daily panel data from YouGov with search data from the UK to try and validate alternative ways of getting at subjective well-being in particular. And the particular question there, specific question there, was about the effect of lockdown policies. We wanted to see, okay, how had lockdown policies, if you had daily data, what was the sequencing of changes in people's subjective well-being, lockdown policies, easing of lockdown policies, and the pandemic. And basically the key thing that we found, or that we argued, was that there was a huge decline in subjective well-being around the time of lockdowns, but it actually preceded the lockdowns, and it was actually when the pandemic started to take off, and actually the lockdown policies themselves didn't actually have that much of an effect. Anyway, so what can you do with search data from Russia? The key thing I would say is that you're very limited in what you can study with search data, because it's very, very difficult to make an inference from what somebody is typing in a search box to what they're thinking. And I would say that the valid measures that we came up with just 3 areas where we could make valid measures, right? The first one, I'll start with mental health, actually, picking up on the pandemic stuff. That one worked really well. Why did that one work really well? Because negative mood states, depression, anxiety, insomnia, tend to cause people to search for self-diagnosis, treatment. And if you look at related queries on Google, you can see that those are almost a lot of the use of those terms when people search is for those purposes, right? And we've got really good validation with trackers on mood state over time, negative mood states, how much in the last week have you felt angry, sad, whatever, and mental health searches online, right? So that kind of works. When people are happy, they don't search for anything in particular. They don't go online and say, "Oh, I'm having a great day." I think you can't do that. But for negative conditions, tends to provoke search activity. The same thing then is true for financial stress, right? So when people need emergency loans, remortgaging, welfare needs, looking for a welfare center, unemployment benefit, that tends to provoke searches of those kinds online. So you can use you can validate economic measures against financial stress. And the third area we looked at is what we call cognitive dissent. And this was a bit more specific to Russia. But what we specifically wanted to look at was measures of critical ideation, right? So the founding assumption here was that in authoritarian regimes, most of the time people are cognitively demobilized, right? You have a strong incentive not to think about politics. So Russia, a lot of people, most of the population don't think very actively about politics if they can avoid it. So the idea here is like, well, are people going online and searching for Wikipedia entries on what is authoritarianism, what is protest, what is democracy, right? The critical books. And what was interesting here is that we actually found this kind of approach of people just kind of trying to find people searching for, trying to educate themselves about political concepts was far more effective than trying to search for, Alexander, for Navalny, right? Or trying to search for things that are kind of in the news, a bit more ephemeral. But this kind of low-level critical cognitive thinking was something that we could actually pick up and track using search data. Okay, and so I'm not going to talk too much today. I will just say a little bit about this methodology because I don't want to talk too much about the findings from it because it's kind of an earlier iteration of the research. But just to say that, we did validate the Google data against the Yandex data. You can still get the Yandex data. It's not a very easy to use platform, but they still provide it. So we could check to see how Google and Yandex data compared. We did a whole bunch of tests, found that they tracked pretty well together, even though, so we didn't think there was particularly different sample of internet users that you were hitting using one or the other. We checked foreign versus VPN. So we tried to compare. We thought, well, maybe there's some kind of bias around searches, like were you kind of uncomfortable to search online now in Russia? But we found that, so we checked people using Russian browsers coming out of VPN exit nodes in Germany or Baltic states, and found not much difference actually among internet users in Russia using Russian browser. I'll skip this. We can always come back. I'll skip this. And I'll just come up with sort of one finding then, right? And there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there we can talk about. But so if we looked at cognitive dissent, for example, we can see that, okay, it shot up at the start of the war. What was interesting, it didn't really react that much to events during the war in terms of Russia winning or losing major battles, but it would always spike. Actually, there are two things that made it spike. Number one was anything around mobilization, right? Like, is conscription becoming more likely, or has it just been announced? Then people would start going online and searching for again, like, Wikipedia entries on authoritarianism or something, what's going on in my country. And the other thing was with Prigozhin. Actually, his videos caused this to spike up as well when he released them, but not Navalny, which was interesting. But it actually makes sense because, in a sense, the people that Prigozhin reached were people who were cognitively demobilized. But when they saw his videos, then they started to think about these issues maybe for the first time. So that was quite interesting. Anyway, so I'm just going to draw a line under that for now. I know time is limited. So I will want to talk for the rest of today around the second avenue, which is the work that is being done by RIWI in Toronto through random domain intercept polling. Just to give you a kind of brief overview for those who don't know about, it's quite an obscure method of trying to get survey data. The history of random domain intercept was an epidemiologist, Neil Seaman, at the University of Toronto. And what he had wanted to do was, after the H1N1 pandemic, he had wanted to develop a methodology that could sort of be more prepared for the next pandemic, right? So how do you do that? Well, what you need then is, it's prohibitively expensive to continuously run large sample surveys via traditional modes, face-to-face, even phone. It's just too expensive, so no one will do it. So you'll always be blind to if another pandemic is emerging. What you need is some new technology that doesn't need to be perfect in terms of sampling, but it needs to be extremely cheap and can be run continuously, right? So every hour, every day, you're picking up people who are answering, preferably with some degree of geolocation, right? So if it's done online via IP address, for example, that tells you roughly where someone is, only requires one or two questions, right? So, loss of taste or smell. Do you have loss of taste or smell? Yes, no, off, right? So simple surveys, continuous, cheap, small number of questions, data that is hopefully geolocatable. Now, for an epidemiologist, that makes a lot of sense, right? So that means that if you suddenly get a cluster of people somewhere in Montreal who report loss of taste or smell, early that there's something going on, right? And for in epidemiological context, that time advantage is valuable, right? Much more valuable to have that a day, a week, month ahead of some other source of data. So that was the idea. Now, it's only fairly recently that this approach to polling has been applied in new contexts. And in particular, again, looping back to where we started, they discovered, I think, well, really during the pandemic, running this in China, for example, or indeed in Russia or Iran, that this is also a very effective means of getting data out of closed societies. You don't have to ask anybody for permission. Nobody can stop you running it. It's actually quite hard. They might try, technologically quite difficult. But you can have continuous data, continuous live data for a few questions of interest. Okay. How does it work? The first iteration was very crude. First iteration, 10, 12 years ago, it was literally buying up expired domain names, right? Or misspelled domain names like Google.com. And anyone who mistyped and landed on that, you could bounce them out to a quick survey, right? And if it's short enough, then enough people would answer it that you would generate. And of course, there's so many users, internet users online, that you generate quite vast amounts of data by doing that fairly quickly. Now, as things moved along, they found that it was quite expensive to buy the domain names yourself, but they could make deals with the web host directly. So for the same amount of money, instead of just buying 10 domain names, you could have 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 50,000. Now I think they have per country 200,000 to 300,000 recently expired domain names where they will offer to bounce people out for you. Okay, you pay us this much, we'll bounce people out who land on those to a poll. And there's also an additional layer on top now where you add in all of the additional paid, which is through apps, through social media ecosystems, boom, boom, boom. And the broad idea, what's the kind of principle? I guess the principle here is that, well, in the 1950s, people went about their daily lives and we tried to intercept them in their real world, right? Door to door, if they would answer the door. If that wasn't enough, you could supplement your sample in places of, outside places of residence, of work, or retail, or whatever. But you would try and build up enough of the sample that would be representative enough of the population through the real world interception. And the idea is that, well, could you replicate something at least vaguely comparable now that we live primarily in a virtual world? And people are very non-responsive when we try and reach them in the real world via more traditional methodologies. Now, the obvious thing you would say here is that, well, surely there's some sample bias, right? Surely there has to be some sample bias. And the obvious answer is yes, right? So, I mean, if your sample consists of misspelled domain names, then you are sampling on people who either secondary language, English or French, or typing very quickly, or have some other trait, right, that would make them mistype and then bounce them out to a survey. And that's completely true. But the only thing I would say to that, of course, is that, well, when you think about it, and I think most people who do survey research, have been in survey research for a while, know, is that, well, that's true of every mode, right? I mean, like, if you go door to door to try and get people face to face, and unless you have a specific person you've been told to interview, you're going to oversample, single person households where it's the one person who lives there who's going to do the interview, rather than a multi-member household, right? Where you just randomly draw one person out of that household, right? And that's just going to be a form of bias that emerges from that method. Right. If you try and call people up on their phones, right? And obviously, I mean, you're going to get people who haven't turned their phones off or have their phones on silent mode. And in general, I mean, you're going to get people who either, have a strong need to give their opinion or have a more compliant personality that just hang up straight away, right? You're always going to get, no matter what method you use, you're always going to select people on some form of heterogeneity you're not aware of, or maybe can dimly think at. Which loops back to my point about, the purpose here is not to replace other forms of surveys, but to supplement and validate, right? To add that additional layer with new technology. So as I say, there's pros and cons. I say, obviously, sample bias is the huge con, and there's a lot of work about sample bias in online polling. It's pretty well established. You're going to get more people. Obviously, your population effectively is internet users. You can't really pretend that that's not the case. And even within that, you might oversample on educational age. But you might be able to converge on a biased estimate because you just have so many responses, right? So even if there's a bias there, there's some research that suggests, well, maybe it's, for some issues at least, it's not that large of a bias, and you can still get pretty converge on some pretty good figure. The big factor here, again, on methodology, is that online sampling very likely reduces sensitivity bias. There's, again, lots of studies. There's one study, there's many studies on that. And that really, I would say that there is a trade-off between sample and sensitivity bias in the methodologies we apply, particularly in authoritarian regimes. And that by using data from the RIWI method, for example, we've traded off sample bias, which we think we've got a lot more of, versus sensitivity bias, which we think we've got significantly less. Okay. Really key point. And we can tolerate sample bias the key thing is that if we are doing high frequency analysis every day looking at changes, we really care. I mean, we would like to not have sample bias, but as long as we feel confident that the sample bias is not changing, at least we have some confidence then in the magnitude of the differences that we see over time, even if we don't have confidence exactly in the baseline figure. Okay. So I'll skip over. We can always come back to this stuff. I'll just give you an idea of scale. I think there's something like 250,000 respondents over the last couple of years, but for each item, it's a different number. Each respondent gets different items. So just for an item, this item, I think, was about views about the war in Ukraine, support or don't support. And you can see, okay, since the start of the war, which was down here, the total number of respondents for that item is actually now probably closer to 100,000. But for any particular subsample within that over a rolling 90-day period, say, we have pretty large sample within 90-day windows. What kind of items are being scooped up? For the stuff that is, I say, quasi-publicly available, in the sense that it can in theory be obtained, is not for clients that have made sure that it could not be obtained by anyone. You have, some basic measures of economic data, political attitudes, as I say, so some items of nationalism, support for the war, as well as some social metrics. And let me just get to now, before I think I'll take another 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes before we can pass the discussion, just to give you an overview of what I would say are some of the key findings we see so far. Number one. Well, actually, probably number one should be the rate of support for both the Kremlin and the war in Ukraine are lower than you might think. But anyway, I'll skip over that and go to number one here, which is that since the start of the war, we see loss of support for the war and for the Kremlin, but not in the places you would necessarily expect. So we always think in terms of, young, highly educated, cosmopolitan citizens in Russia, being the basis of opposition to the regime. And that's true. This is a demographic that doesn't like Putin very much. The only problem is that individuals in Russia aged 18 to 35 who live in big cities, like cities over 1 million people, there's quite a few cities in Russia, that's like 4% of the population, right? So that is not a demographic Putin is particularly worried about, particularly because it was a demographic that has left the country in fairly large numbers in recent years as well. So it may be true that you find opposition there, but that's not really, that's not really driving big changes in public opinion as a whole within Russia. However, what we do find is that some of the demographics you would think of as being most within the kind of core United Russia or pro-Putin demographic are precisely the groups that have had the largest loss of support over the last couple of years. So if we look at, say, just a couple of items for this analysis, slightly lateral questions. Again, that's kind of a sensitivity bias concern. So, in the midst of a global power struggle, which group has the upper hand, US, Europe, and their allies, or China, Russia, and their allies? It's a slightly lateral question, but you can probably assume that anyone in Russia who says the US, Europe, and their allies have the upper hand probably doesn't think the war is going very well. And another question on nationalism, right? Whether people should always support Russia, even if the country's policies and actions are in the wrong. We look at those two items, start with that nationalism item, that second one there, you support your country, right or wrong. We can see that, okay, black line here is the general population. Gray line is the general population, and the black line is each demographic. So we can see that, okay, for women, it declined more than the general population, and that gap's become quite large. But interestingly, for the underemployed, so for those who are part-time employed or unemployed, again, same thing, that became quite large, that gap. Those in lower education, larger decline. Those in rural areas and small towns, huge decline relative to big cities, right? So what is going on there? And in all of those cases, these are absolute. So basically, there wasn't really much difference between men or women or underemployed and full employed, lower higher education, rural versus city at the start in 2022 in March, but that gap has grown, right? And these groups are actually less nationalistic than the general population at this point in time. So what unites that? Well, I think the obvious read, but I'm open to discussion, but what sort of strikes me is that those groups who are susceptible to conscription are the groups who've actually become the most afraid and the most disillusioned from the regime. We see something pretty similar around the item about who's winning this conflict, basically pretty similar. So for men and women, actually no difference there. But you see, again, the underemployed, bigger drop. Less educated, bigger drop. Rural areas, small towns, bigger drop, right? So, and these are precisely, of course, the groups where actually much more likely to know somebody who's fighting in the army, maybe to know somebody who's died in the war so far, and to be afraid of being called up, potentially oneself, have a member of one's family called up to fight. So that's quite interesting. I think this also explains, I remember giving this presentation just after the presidential election in Brussels. Gave the presentation in Brussels. The presidential election was in Russia, of course. And yeah, I think people had a general sense that, yeah, this explains why the Kremlin was so paranoid about not letting an anti-war or a lukewarm war candidate run, even one who was kind of controlled by the Kremlin and was official opposition, because they kind of knew that actually there's a lot of people out there who actually don't oppose the regime necessarily, but really don't like the war. So could end up voting for that candidate and creating a bit of an upset at the polls, and that's why they weren't prepared to allow that. Maybe I'll come back to this for the sake of time, but we did look which groups had the largest shifts from kind of most recent polling since the start of the war on these items. And again, you can see that, yeah, small town, rural areas, non-university educated, these again are the ones that had the largest shift in their kind of estimated association with those items. Okay. I'll skip this. We can do geo. Interestingly, this hasn't actually, this is one of the advantages of this method is that you do get good geolocation. It just happens to be the case that we didn't find anything particularly too exciting. We did find, I mean, a lot of people wanted to know, okay, what's going on in Bashkortostan because there were protests. What about Tatarstan? And indeed, Tatarstan people are not terribly happy right now. Although probably had their disagreements with the regime for some time, and that's for reasons that are not fully related to the war. But anyway, that's something that's possible with the data. I will skip this. Oops. I will skip this partly, but yeah, we can always come back to that. We maybe skip this. Just one point here about, again, coming back to the issue of sensitivity bias. There is a really striking contrast between what you see from the Storm or Levada polls when people are asked about how confident they are in their financial situation. And you see these figures of sort of 60, 70% confidence, optimism about the future. And then really the exact same question in the RIWI surveys. And the figures are just incommensurably different, right? It's like, it fell at the start of the war, didn't increase. It fell right from the start. And it's low. Really low, right? I mean, so you have something like a quarter to maybe a third maximum who say that they have optimism about their financial future. And that cannot be a sample bias issue, right? I mean, just logically, to have figures on the opposite end of the spectrum, this must be sensitivity bias. This must be a sensitivity bias issue. There's no way that you could randomly draw from the same population to end up with such completely different results. Maybe I'll skip this. And one thing that we're discussing right now, but I will talk about, I mean, one of the beauties of using alternative data is that you have, or online data is you have a really rich suite of metadata to work with. So not only what device people are using, smartphone or whatever, but operating system, when did they last update it, how many years ago did they update the operating system, which version of it, there's like hundreds and hundreds of possible entries for that, as well as when people are online, because this is continuous. So, people who are more nationalistic, maybe this is true across the world, tend to be early morning people, so tend to fill out the surveys in the morning. People like myself who are, decadent evening types go online late in the day, and I guess that's maybe there's actually some psychological literature about this, of course, about time of day, activity, and political attitudes. But it's more psychological. But anyway, so we can see, interesting to see that. Yeah, I'll skip this. You can identify by device and platform. That can be very useful if you want to try and reach people for informational purposes. If you want to do online advertising or something, reach people with a particular viewpoint, then of course that's very rich data. Now, one thing methodologically that's really interesting is that there is now in development an additional suite of metadata tools looking at eyeball tracking and micro-expression recognition. So the idea is that when somebody's answering a question, and amazingly, it's something like 1/3 opt-in in Russia right now, which is really amazing that people would 1/3 of respondents are happy to let you use their camera. But what that means is that you can get you can now compare, right? That would be to say, okay, somebody says that you show them a picture of Putin, right? And you can see, okay, there's an expression of disgust. Do they look away? How long do they take? Well, we already have within the metadata, like how long people take, do they hover, change question, that kind of thing. We already have that. But with the eyeball tracking stuff, you could do, and with the facial recognition, that's right. Well, could do facial recognition. We wouldn't do that, but for micro expression recognition, yeah, you get a much richer suite. And so we have a project that we're hoping to start with some colleagues in Chicago in a couple of months on that. And I will finish now, because I'm at 30 minutes or so, and we need some time for discussion. I will finish just by saying that this is only one example of the projects that are in the field right now. So beyond Russia, there are many others, many other countries that are quite difficult to survey. The same time as the Russia survey was initiated, the Iran survey, Daily Tracker, was initiated as well. So we have quite rich data from Iran, and the China surveys began well before that. China was really one of the first surveys, daily trackers. So that's 6 years at least running in China. I kind of skip this. I mean, just as kind of proof of concept, right? We don't really trust economic data in China anymore. But what's interesting is that you can validate alternative economic data like energy production, which we think in China is kind of reliable still as official data, with some of the survey metrics that are more economic indicators, asking people about monthly household income or employment rates, that kind of thing. For Iran, I wouldn't want to talk too much about Iran because it's great to talk about something that's contemporary and salient, but it's just in terms of the actual analysis of the Iran data, I think it's at a much earlier stage because the incentive to look into it and find detail is fairly recent. Well, there's a couple of things that I've noticed so far that are kind of interesting. So when you asked me, there was a question about how people feel in Iran about about Tehran's policy towards Israel. What's quite interesting is that it's interesting that it's quite low level of support. That's kind of interesting. Could be some sample bias issue, definitely, but maybe not just that. What was interesting was after the October 7th attack, that actually fell. That actually went down. People in Iran said they were less likely to approve of how their government was behaving towards Israel. And it only went up again, first ceasefire, and then it rose pretty much straight away. So that's interesting, but there's a lot more work there that has to be done. And this is still being collected. So this is the data set series up until like 4 or 5 months ago. But even today, there is new data coming in for this. Just a question of having the time and the energy to look at it. Okay, so I think that's where I want to round off. I don't need to say anything on this. Yes, new paradigm, blah, blah, blah. Very good. Qualitative, quantitative, static, real-time data, low cost, high resolution. But, in life in general, there is always an advantage to being on the technological frontier, if we can, and not being stuck behind like this poor fellow. Thank you, and